Well, did you guess which type of original research R4B students do most often? It's surveys. R4B students often create surveys. That's the vast majority of the original research that happens in this class. Why is that? Well, it might be because it's what we're familiar with. They're fairly easy to create and distribute. You can remotely gather data, like you don't have to go into the field like you do with field work, right? And oftentimes the survey programs will just automatically calculate data for us. These are all advantages. The flip side of this, though, is that most people don't like taking surveys. Think about yourself, right? You're probably asked fairly often to take them, and if you're like most people, you just don't accept a lot of those invitations. This is partly because surveys are time consuming, and a lot of that's an issue with a lot of surveys. They're just longer than they should be. But there's also this whole thing with survey fatigue. These days in this society we're in, like, people are constantly after data, and it's like, you take a survey and then someone asks you to take a survey about the survey that you just took, and you can't escape. um, the good news is that most people do like to help and share their opinions. That's what we got to leverage here. So our challenges are twofold. Okay, we got to keep surveys short and user friendly, and we also have to accurately measure what people think. Because one thing we'll find is that because people like to help, it often influences how they share their opinions. Let's look at some strategies for creating good surveys that people actually want to take. Okay. Before you can do anything, you have to get started, and you got to pick a platform. If you go online, like Best Survey App, you'll find things like this Zapier article that will list, various options with various features. But if you're a Berkeley student, the one I would recommend is Qualtrics. This is a professional grade program that is free to those with a CalNet ID and passphrase. All right, I started using it and I love it. I encourage you to do it as well. It can just do a lot of cool stuff that these other platforms can't, and there's no limits. Like, SurveyMonkey, for instance, good user-friendly platform, limits you to 10 questions. On the other hand, that may be all the questions that we need. The other aspect of getting started is to not really think about the questions you're going to ask so much as the answers, right? What are you trying to learn from the survey? You got to know this before you can start crafting the questions. Now let's look at how we actually go about crafting the questions. All right, how do we get good answers? Rule number one: you keep language simple and concise. One of the big problems of surveys out there is that the questions are just wordy. Keep them simple, keep them short. This has been shown to actually, this increases the chances people will actually do the survey. We also need to think about a mix of data, right? We want things like numbers, percentages, but we also want stuff like quotes, right? Well, for something quantitative, you've got your standard question options like multiple choice, but also things like ranking, like on a scale of 1 to 7, check boxes, check all the ways, or even just matching things, right? Qualitative, that's stuff like a short answer or an essay type question. Most survey experts suggest that we focus on the close-ended quantitative types of questions rather than the open-ended or qualitative ones like this stuff. And the consensus seems to be that you should limit yourself to 2 open-ended questions, and you should ask them last. All right. More on questions. There's a lot of bad surveys out there, and at the heart of every bad survey are some bad questions. All right, here are some common issues with surveys. All right, one is questions like this: how satisfied are you with your relationship on a scale of 1 to 5? Well, that's a bad question because relationships are big and complex, and they have a lot of components, right? Think about all the things that can go into a relationship. Okay, on a scale of 1 to 5, how satisfied are you with the following aspects of your relationship? Well, right, what are some aspects? For example, you've got things like communication. You might have things like division of labor. Like if you're, for instance, cohabitating, there might be things like intimacy. etc., right? I mean, the list goes on and on, right? The more components you add to this, the better the data, the more meaningful the data you're going to get, the more you're going to have to work with, all right? On that note, just as we can delineate here, watch out for questions like this. Do you try to meet new romantic partners on dating sites and through social media? Well, this thing's asking two things, right? It's asking about dating sites. It's also asking about social media. For some people, the answer might be yes to one and no to the other. It's a bad question. All right, how about this? How do you try to meet new partners? Check the appropriate boxes, and then we can get, dating sites, social media, family, through family, through your friends, and so on, right? Again, the more things we can list, the more meaningful the data is going to be, all right? Another way to get better data is to use interval questions. This is like a ranking or rating scale type things. Here's do you think government should pass a law requiring men and women to be paid equally? Yes or no? Well, there's shades of gray on this. All right, well, why not let people say on a scale of 1 to 7 how they feel about that? And on that note, never force respondents to answer a question. All right, this is why. When people don't want to answer a question, you know what they do? They stop taking your survey, and you lose everything. All right, going back to this one, some people might look at this and go, I don't know, and then they click the exit button. All right, so you give people an out. What's the best place to meet a new partner? I don't know. Which of these first date options would you be most excited about? Other. Always give them an out. All right. They might not want to answer that question, but maybe they'll answer the next one. Once you have a sense of your questions, organize them with a funnel approach. Start with the general ones, the easy ones, and then move on to the more specific ones. And again, keep those open-ended questions at the end. All right. One of the other big issues with surveys, though, is that they're often unreliable. This is oftentimes due to bias or issues with the construction of the survey. Here's what the experts say we should do. One thing you often see at the beginning of surveys is they ask you for demographic info. Before they show you any questions, they say, what's your gender? How old are you? What's your race? And, do that stuff at the end. Here's why. This mitigates something called stereotype threat. You may have heard of this, but here's an example. You ask women to identify their gender before a math test, they do worse in the test. That's because we've got all these stereotypes in society about women and math, and when you ask people to start thinking consciously about their gender, well, that influences how they feel and then how they perform. Another example of this, you say something like, identify your gender. Well, I'm a man. And then you start asking questions and they start thinking, well, since I'm a man, I should say manly things. What would a man say? And they might, answer based on, what they think they're expected to say rather than how they actually feel. All right. On that note, don't show your moves. Don't explain what you're trying to do with the survey because people want to help and they will try to say what is the right thing rather than be honest. One way to get around this is, if you're trying to figure out something about whether people watch TV, throw in another thing. Ask a question about food. That keeps them guessing. That's another good element of survey design. All right, and then finally, we have to avoid leading questions, right? Leading in the sense that the question has an implicit correct answer. Take a look at this one. In your opinion, should people get divorced even though it causes children to suffer? The implicit answer to this question is no, right? Because who wants children to suffer, right? That's not a good question, right? Here's another example. Should tech companies embrace diversity and equality and hire more women? The implicit answer is yes, right? Because we think, diversity is good, right? You saying you don't want diversity, right? We got to find whips. We got to find ways to ask questions in a way that doesn't sort of push respondents into a particular direction, all right? Now we've seen some techniques for writing good questions. Head to the next activity and let's see if you can improve a couple bad survey questions.